So I just wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming back or for being here this afternoon. This is a unique pleasure for me to introduce our artist for this afternoon, a very, very dear friend of mine who I have the privilege of teaching with at Westminster Conservatory in Princeton. This is also our first concert in the Westminster Concert Series. We have our next concert will be coming up the first Sunday of December. Those of you who were here last year and saw the Atlas Brass Quintet, they will be returning that first Sunday, so we welcome them again for a family-friendly concert of holiday favorites. Our recital this afternoon is truly, I think, going to be a treat. It is a combination of music for unaccompanied flute interspersed with original poetry written by our artist. And I encourage you, as you are appreciating and enjoying the performance, to please, if you can, make some mental notes if there are some things that you would like to ask her about, or any background that you would like to know about how she developed this program. Because we are going to have a brief Q&A right at the end of the performance. I think Barbara and I are going to start it off with some questions and answers, and then we'll open it up to all of you. I think there's just some wonderful background to how she developed this program that I think all of you will find very interesting. I did want to point out that the way that this program is set up is a very introspective performance, and so there's no applause until the very end. I also encourage you, if it helps you, to follow along in your program, as all of the poetry that she will be reading is also in print here for you if you happen to be a visual person. So, without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to a marvelous musician and a dear person with a beautiful spirit, Barbara Williams.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to Pastor John and to this wonderful congregation. I enjoyed it very much coming last Sunday, and thank you for the warm welcome. It was a wonderful sermon service and a lovely congregation, so it's an honor to be here. And I also wanted to just say how treasured Jen is at Westminster, and what a joy it has been to get to know her over the years and to work with her. She, you hear about 3-ring circuses, but she can manage a 50-ring circus. It's just extraordinary to see her at work and to play with her and for her different classes. It's been a wonderful experience for me. So this program evolved over many years. I've always loved unaccompanied flute literature. It's complete in itself, it's nourishing, and it's very easy to turn to without having to organize rehearsals with others, so free moments. I've really loved it. The pieces on today's program have inspired me and given me strength and solace and joy, and they mostly draw on nature. In recent years, I've also begun to write poetry, and designing a solo program with poetry interspersed sort of came naturally. This is the result. I'd like to just mention a few things about the poems. Love on Wheels refers to sewing up some tires. My husband, when we first went on a bike ride, he was experimenting with racing tires, which are made for the racetrack, and they're called sew-ups. They're very thin and delicate. They don't do so well on a road. So that's what that's all about. In The Violinist, in that poem, there are 2 Italian names. Giacometti is a great Swiss sculptor, 20th century sculptor. And his trademark is very long, skinny figures with massive feet anchored in a big block. Then the other name is Guarneri, that's like a Stradivarius, maker of a great violin. music in Trillium. I just wanted you to know that that refers to an early spring woodland wildflower, very delicate. And it's sort of hard to find wildflower. And then there are two French titles, and for those who don't speak French, Le vent à travers les ruines means the wind through the ruins, and that piece was perhaps inspired by an earlier piece by Francis Poulenc called Un joueur de flûte berce les ruines, a player of the flute lullabying or lullabies the ruins. And then the last Spanish title, the last piece is Danza de la Mariposa, Dance of the Butterfly. Okay? So I hope you enjoy the program. It's a delight to be here and offer it. Early to the woods. Come, my dear. Slip through the gate of our new morning. Take the brookside path to see the dew pearls roll down cabbage throats. Watch a doe slow pick beside her fawn, a leafy breakfast from the understory. And spy a hunting fox come unaware. Retreat, his tail a streamer floating. Hear the flickers drum for mates, and scream, "Hear, hear, hear, hear," and pierce 100 holes in pulpit stump in Poplar Grove's cathedral. Come, let the stream that flows through scattered granite and sings of rain that's washed all night this refuge, wash us, bless, renew us. to love at winter's end. Come, my love, walk with me, and show me what's astir along the woodland's edge. What burst at seed broke through to pierce earth's rugged crust? What light-drawn tips denied a downward pull, whose roots have infiltrated hard ground and anchored mounting shoots? O love, O life, persistent, urgent, what pulse beat yet through time so hard, so cold, so dangerous, dark and fruitless? Drill down, penetrate the dense, to fix our roots round rock that won't give way when winds assail the upward growth. And by your warmth, draw us to light. through in humid heat, on sticky tar, by fences long and rustic, grasses high and kudzu thick, and all was lush and green in Frederick County. Remember that first day when heavens opened and we welcomed that, 3 times no less, and kept on riding, smiling, drenched, refreshed, amused by it and happy in each other's company. And I sat by the road to sew 3 times no less your skinny, fragile tires, while you counted windows of the distant barns or watched me patiently. Remember how on later rides you'd come on up beside me, daring man, and plant one hand behind my shoulder, pedal for me, gallant, strong and steady. Or we'd ride hand in hand on wider lanes, wheels parallel and hearts content. Remember how you coaxed me up the coastal range for my first view of the Pacific, saying at each bend of Serpentine, just a little farther, and then another steep incline I thought would never end, and I learned not to pedal hard. Remember how we dreamed a Viking honeymoon up the coast of Finland, down the coast of Norway. Well, Page Mill Road and Old La Honda up to Skyline were enough for me, through chaparral and eucalyptus, oh, the dry and pungent air. Remember packing tiny Sarah on your back for her first ride, her humming in your ear close harmonies with wind, and tasting ice cream on Sand Hill. And then you left 1 month to ride 3,000 miles with George. Oh, my stalwart. Remember coming home all brown and bearded, happy to take rest and welcome one more child, and bike a daily outing, Jessie bright-eyed on your back, Sarah belted in behind you, dog leash in one hand, notorious man, how the neighbors frowned. You got us touring bikes, fitted them with panniers, engineered the perfect gears. How we sailed along the coastal road, Big Basin to Carmel, Ventana and Big Sur, the bracing air, through wind and sun, up and down the rocky cliffs, past tide pools, whales and seals. And then the crash, but only stocks. Not you, not us, not bikes, nor spirits. Remember how we shifted gears and took a plunge to live and bike elsewhere, hand in hand abroad, through Roman arches and medieval towns, together wheeling through some years of otherness among the vineyards of Alsace, patchwork land of pagans, dukes, and saints, and forests blessed by druids, farmlands carved by ancient rivers, blood-soaked former battlefields. And you biked up the ringing valley for our daily bread. And once we crossed the Rhine and pedaled up to Donau-Eschingen to weave our way along the Danube all the way to Ulm. Remember, starting fresh again stateside, how we braved the logging traffic north through Maine to province of Quebec in unrelenting rain and biting cold that took their toll, and how at last we gave it up a while until the quiet Princeton summers when we too ventured gentle loops on local paths and crossed the Delaware to celebrate our decades. How we slowed and breathed and savored, counted blessings. Remember how we did our very best and laughed to tears and couldn't stop. Surely You remember still these cyclings, and not the wheels of your last bed which never rolled at all, nor those that coasted your remains in sacred silence down the drive in one last glide, which I'll remember ever, smooth and free and graceful, so like you. winter music, beech tree by the brook. Unswayed by tempest, loss, and longing, rooted, calm, you beckon as before. Welcome my shy contour trace of your smooth sinew, dove gray and winter hard, with subtle tambourine, brittle flutter of pale leaves, translucent, unreleased, through winter shimmering. Lure the wind, snaring wet and life-spelled melodies. the violinist. He stood that night, feet fixed as if by Giacometti, motionless, alone in darkened space, spotlit and poised on 3 converging pools of honeyed light. Warm shafts poured down upon him left and right, cast sidelong shadows from his heels. From just behind, a third shone high above and framed a shorter, darker one. Applause had ceased, the crowd now stilled. Guarneri shouldered, bow aloft, with one incisive triple stop of vibrant, biting chord. The dance began. With fiery strokes, he plunged in twisting lines of devilish design, from lurching fugues and finely chiseled counterpoint, to yield, in subtle resolution, threaded phrases fine as ether, diffuse as ghosts, like 3 joined at his feet, who mirrored every jest and every shift of weight in perfect unity, leaning, lunging, then arriving at repose. So entranced, did he perceive the supple shapes that shadowed him, like waving phantoms of a pulsing spirit, force of life so fierce it made 3 shades to dance. forthright. Love refused all doubt and anchored us in fertile ground, strong against the future's rage, grew trunk-like, sturdy, weathered fear, despair, each season adding one more ring to fortify, like that great beech whose limbs embraced you on the day you paused beneath it, long on our last ramble. The pines are gone. The old oak lost its twin to a frightful storm. But now, beneath our beech's mangled crown, stand defiant a multitude of saplings. Life and love surge on, firm in root and fresh in form. a butterfly. To a butterfly. Emerge, you beauty, break through, step forth, unfurl your wings, stretch and dry, breathe, bask, taste the dew. You are free to circle back, but now to fly, to light on color, drink the offered nectar. Soar o'er hill or hedgerow, mountain, wall, or river. Delicate, live, ever welcome. Wear the boundary.
first discussing her program, we were sitting together in her studio at Westminster, and about halfway through our conversation, I said, gosh, I really wish that I had had a video camera because this would have made a perfect documentary. Because really hearing the background of how she developed this program, clearly she didn't just sit up last night and say, well, here's some great pieces that I'm just going to throw together. And as she said, this was years in the developing this program. And so what I thought I would do is just kind of get the ball rolling with a couple of questions, some things that came out of our discussion together, and then open it up to all of you if you had any questions or things that you wanted some more insight on, or things that you wanted to ask about the performance itself. So the first thing I wanted to ask Barbara to talk a little bit about is one of the elements that makes this program so unique is the inclusion of music for unaccompanied flute. And the way Barbara had described it to me was that the flute is an instrument who loves to play with friends. So usually when you go to a flute recital or a concert, it's with the piano, it's with other flutes, it's in an orchestra type setting. And clearly the flute by itself engenders lots of different techniques that we don't get to hear the flute do when we hear it as a solo instrument here at church or when we hear it in the orchestra. And so much so that you commented that many flutists shy away from this genre of music. So could you talk a little bit about unaccompanied flute, what drew you to it, and what scares other flute players from venturing into it?
Well, I think what scares people is that, you know, if you're used to playing with others, there's that security of being together, and also the, you know, the other textures, and people are playing while you're not. You have a little time out. And if you're playing music for unaccompanied flute, you are responsible for the entire interpretation. You're responsible for the arc of attention and the arc of musical narrative, the drama, the pauses. Everything has to fit. And often we have a conductor doing that for us, or we've talked with other musicians, our colleagues, about how we're going to take it, and then, as I said, we do have time out. So it's a lot more demanding in that sense. However, and I never aspired to this, it's just that I found myself really enjoying the completeness of these works, because the composer, when they're writing for, when he or she is writing for an unaccompanied flute, all of the harmony is incorporated. So you have the chords through arpeggios and others, or maybe two voices. You'll have some lower notes and upper notes, but the harmony is there. And so it's rather satisfying. Instead of playing my part of a sonata, or my part from a symphony or whatever, but that's you don't have the whole. So that's pretty exciting, but it is demanding. It demands more stamina, more focus, and then of course when composers start writing for this solo flute, they're interested in, well, what other effects are possible, and so there are extended techniques and sort of magical things, and those of course take time to get used to incorporate as a player. So that's a start in the answer.
So the second element that, of course, makes this such a unique program is the element of the poetry. And to those of you who don't know Barbara, you might think, well, this has been a lifelong passion of yours, that you have written poetry for many, many years. But as you and I know, this is a much more recent pursuit. So something added later to the resume that hadn't been on there previously. So how did you come to poetry? What drew you to that? I know there was a specific thing that drew you into poetry itself. So if you could talk a little bit about how you found yourself drawn to composing your own poetry, and then what influenced you in the different, because obviously you have very different styles in the different poems that you chose in the program. So what influenced your different writing techniques and the subject matter itself?
Well, to be honest, I haven't written that much, and I almost am embarrassed to count myself among poets. But I know that I aspired to be a writer when I was growing up. I loved reading, and I loved English, but when I went to school, I fell in love with music to the point that I just didn't have time for more, to pursue writing or more literature. And so that's the old story. So there's a lot of love for language in me, but what sort of brought me to poetry, and I actually never was excited about poetry, it was other types of literature, but working with these pieces, and also as a teacher, and trying to encourage my students more and more to play more expressively and play more wholeheartedly and play like they mean it. And working with this music, I was thinking of how poetic the music was. Well, what does that mean? I didn't really know, but there was a rhetorical aspect to it. And then one day, just at the right time in my life, I realized there was a poetry workshop in Princeton that was just on the right, Friday morning when I could manage to go weekly, with a wonderful teacher. And so I jumped in, and Winter Music, Beech Tree by the Brook, was the poem I wrote for that first meeting. Sort of felt my way after, loving for years, walking in the woods and being inspired by nature, and also after having lost my husband 3 years earlier. That poetry, I don't really know poetic techniques, but the combination of having a sense of musical rhythm and having a love of language, I was greatly encouraged by that teacher and by the others in the workshop. And so as I've had time, I've continued to write a little bit, but I don't have enough time. However, these, working on this kind of music, when you need a break, of course you're always thinking and feeling, and there are things that have inspired you, or there are images, or on the walk that you took after practicing, there something gels, and you go home and write it down. So bit by bit, these poems have written themselves, and I found that to offer a whole program of unaccompanied flute solos may seem daunting to an audience, and it may seem daunting to the flutist as well. And so the idea came to just intersperse so that there would be a little break from the music. And then also, sitting in poetry readings, which I've done, they go by too fast. And I really, really like having a chance and like offering a chance to the audience to just stay with the poem for a little bit. And so I feel that they both help each other in a way in a program. You can tell me if you found it to be true. So that's a little how this came about.
No. So the last question I was going to ask before I open it up to all of you, if you had any questions that you wanted to ask, and you alluded to this actually in both of the early questions, was how did you come across to the decision-making process of which poems seem to really meld well, or that marriage of the poetry with the music? How did you make those choices of which pieces seem to fit the poems well, or vice versa? Were there other iterations of things that you said, okay, this isn't quite the meaning I'm trying to get across, and so I want to move things around a little bit. So if you could talk a little bit about how you arrived at the specific choice of pieces and poetry.
It's such an intuitive thing, and it was a very gradual process. Some of the poetry, as I said, was inspired by walks in the woods, and of course the pieces were too. The first one, Coursing Through the Still Green, was inspired by a Chinese poem about a river or a stream coursing through the forest. Yeah, those poems. I mean, I wrote the poems, to the woods, early to the woods, and to love at winter's end, without thinking of this of this music, but then the juxtaposition just seemed to work. And then there's also, you know, the slowness, the meditativeness, the drama, the joy, the dance. There are all these different elements that sort of are there, and the contrast is important. And so, you know, your program sort of starts to fall together in that sense. And I knew I wanted to end the program with the Dance of the Butterfly, but I didn't have a poem for that. And I just kept working, you know, as I kept working on the program, I kept listening, and one day, and especially, you know, informed by our current events and just my heart being with those people who are crossing borders, and especially the children, that just came out one day, that poem. I should say that piece by Valerie Coleman, who's an African-American composer, it was inspired by the butterflies of South America, so that all seemed to work together. Just a few comments about the juxtapositions. Poulenc is the oldest composer on the program, 20th century, very much better known than the others. French composer, and his piece, he wrote a very short piece just in response to seeing the city of Tours in France after it had been bombed, just destroyed during the World War II. And the composer Yuko Uebayashi is a younger Japanese composer who's living in France. And I can't help but think that her piece, The Wind Through the Ruins, was somehow a response to Poulenc's piece. She must have known it. Although it was only discovered, Poulenc's piece, around 1990, and her piece was written not too long after that. Elizabeth Brown is a friend of mine. She's a wonderful flutist, as is Catherine Hoover. I knew her. She recently passed on. She was a great New York flutist and very well-known composer. And then Valerie Coleman is a flutist. So those are pieces I've encountered in flute communities for a while. I'm straying. But there are just lots of connections, and they all you know, just appealed to my heart. Hendrik Hofmeyr lives in South Africa. He's a South African composer, and his piece, Incantissimo, was inspired by the idea of the spirit of an ancestor reappearing and having its say in an ephemeral, sensual way, and then flitting off again. And you notice the reference to phantoms, you know, the poem "The Violinist." That seemed like a nice juxtaposition. So.
I just find all of this wonderful information just a treasure to have after hearing the performance and knowing all of the intention and the thought and the love that went into the selection of everything between the writing of the poetry, the preparing and the practicing and presenting of the music. So did any of you have any questions that you wanted to ask? Barbara? Yes, okay. Roy?
It was beautiful, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I love reading the poems as you played after them. And sense of that informing the poem. It was beautiful. One verse seems to me to capture the artistry that you have brought of poetry and flute together. And it's in your first poem. It's "Lure the wind, snaring wet and life-spell melodies." Thank you for sharing with us your love of nature, your love of writing, your love of your galant and stalwart custom. It's beautiful. I have one question, and that is, could you take us to the artist workshop and show and demonstrate to us one of those techniques, extended techniques you had to learn to do what you did today. Something we wouldn't hear in an orchestra, but a technique you had to learn that we wouldn't hear if you were just playing in an orchestra.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. So maybe some of the special tonguing or the in trillium, the multiple notes.
Well, there's flutter tonguing, where you just like you roll your R, you roll your tongue, you know, by and blowing. That's one effect. People who can't roll their R's have a hard time with that. They wind up doing more of a gargling. And then. Do you hear two tones? That's unusual, and we call that multiphonics, when you are sounding more than one note at once, and that comes through just alternative fingerings. And then overblowing. So I'm fingering one low note, and I'm trilling, I'm venting, you know, one hole, and then I'm overblowing. So the harmonic. You can get these different partials by blowing through a tighter aperture and with more forceful air. So those are the harmonics, and then you can do that. You heard that in one of the pieces, the trillium, the trill, and then the. So those are a few.
Yeah.
And then another thing that Elizabeth Brown does, she's a shakuhachi player, a Japanese hand-blown flute.
Right.
She's very inspired by that palette of colors and techniques, and so she tries to do that. She's a magnificent, you know, silver flute player too, Western flutist. But she experiments, and so there's one part where you would think the notes would be, I mean they're fingered. Just a conventional C, B, A, G, F. But you leave your thumb off, and it becomes a glissando just to the next tone down. So that's something my students really love.
But a lot of these elements would be something lost, certainly in an orchestra.
Right.
But you know,
Right.
even in, you know, of course you play in a flute
That's
quartet.
true. That's true.
Right? I mean, that's something very unique to
Right.
flute playing by itself without anything
and
else.
you start throwing those things into a flute quartet or a larger ensemble, which Elizabeth Brown does, but it takes a heck of a lot of practicing on everyone's part and much rehearsing to, you know, to pull off those effects and also then have the ensemble.
And gel as an ensemble too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. Terry, you had a question?
Mine is much more basic, but I thank you so much. It was a lovely recital, Barbara. I was just curious as to how early you started to study and why the flute. I find it such an difficult instrument.
Yes. I was given a guitar when I was about 8 by my uncle and grandfather, who were self-taught folk singers, and they taught me songs they knew, and they didn't teach me how to read music. I don't think they knew how to, and so I fooled around with that for many years. I loved all of Joan Baez's folk songs and many others. But when I was 16, my parents asked me if I would like to take, real lessons on an instrument, and I had heard the flute, I had liked it, but I hadn't really aspired to play it, and so I missed all of the band and all of the school music programs. So, but when I was 16, I began with the second flutist of the National Symphony. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I studied with him for 2 years, and I fell in love with it. When I went off to college, I studied with Jacob Berg, who was the first flutist of the St. Louis Symphony, and just an amazing artist. I went to all of their concerts. You know, they had back then 24 different concerts, a series of 24 different programs through the academic year, got student tickets, and so by the end of my freshman year, I decided to major in music, and didn't write again except for music. So that was a rather intense music major to try to catch up, because I was way behind. Most flutists start at the age of 8 or 9, and then I met my husband after graduating. I wasn't ready for graduate school, and we just went off and did other things, as you heard, some of those adventures. So it was a number of years before I got back to playing. And then living in France for 5 years, I played over there, but in a rather informal way. I was the soloist, the flutist with an a cappella French group that specialized in chansons de variété, sort of popular French songs, which was loads of fun. And it wasn't until I moved to Princeton in '95 with my husband and children that I was able to get back to really serious classical work in the flute, with the flute. And I just enjoyed it ever since. It's been an adventure, and I always feel like I'm a young flutist because my colleagues are so, they've been so much more consistent and have so many more years under their fingers. But they've been very wonderful to me, and it's been a real joy. So.
It's a very welcoming department.
Yes.
All the flutists at Westminster.
In fact, flutists get along famously. We have it's a huge national flute association that meets every summer, and it's famous for the collegiality and the sharing, and you can rub shoulders with people at the very top of the profession.
Right.
You can be an amateur adult or an aspiring young student. It's a wonderful community, and we have a microcosm of that at Westminster.
Exactly.
Did anyone else have any other questions they wanted to ask? No? All right.
It's not questions, it's just, it seems like poetry is like informing the flute, and the flute comes back and interprets the poetry in its way. It's symbiotic.
I'm so glad it came across that way. Did everybody hear poetry informing the flute music and then the flute interpreting the poetry? It's not literally doing that, but it's really wonderful that
If you close your eyes and think about it, you
yes.
listen to the flute and remember the poetry.
Yes, yes. And of course, having just read one of those poems, that is in my thought. However, I think of these pieces and poems, I think of them as in conversation rather than, interpreting each other. But definitely a responsiveness. So you're such a wonderful, sensitive, and eloquent audience. So thank you.
Thank you for being here, Barbara.
So I know many of you brought some delicious, delicious desserts for us to partake in. So we're going to adjourn to Upper Fellowship Hall. We have the deacon's famous recipe for punch to go with peach cobbler and brownies and cookies and all kinds of goodies. So please enjoy and visit with Barbara as we have some refreshments.